Hello, welcome. My name is Tufan Kıymaz. I am from Bilkent University Department of Philosophy, and here is with us Jonathan Payton, my colleague from Bilkent Philosophy Department, and he will be giving a talk about philosophy of action. Just a few words, though, before we start about Jonathan. So Jonathan Payton, so he's an assistant professor at Bilkent University Department of Philosophy. He graduated from, got his PhD from University of Toronto. In Canada. So he works on metaphysics and philosophy of action and philosophy of language. And he has many publications in top academic journals worldwide. And he has published his first book, actually, Negative Actions. The title of the book is Negative Actions, Events, Absences, and the Metaphysics of Agency. And it is published by Cambridge University Press. All right, so Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks everyone for being here and for inviting me. I'm gonna try to share my screen here. Okay, so that's good. It's all taking up the full screen for everybody. Great. Okay, so the task I sort of set myself with the title of this talk is to give an introduction to the philosophy of action. That's actually kind of a tall order. The philosophy of action encompasses a wide range of topics, and there's no way I could give a comprehensive treatment, even in a semester-long class, let alone a talk of this sort. But what I hope to do is give at least one entry point into thinking about the nature of human action, human agency in a philosophical way. So perhaps the best place to start is to say a little bit about how I conceive of philosophy of action and really philosophy more generally. This is usually the question that philosophers dread to be asked. What is philosophy exactly? It is in itself actually one of the most difficult philosophical questions there is. What exactly it is that we're all up to. But one way into this comes from the American philosopher Wilfrid Sellars, who said, "The aim of philosophy, abstractly formulated, is to understand how things, in the broadest possible sense of the term, hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term." Nice and vague, not really all that precise. But I think he's largely right. And you can see as you start learning more about philosophy, it gets subdivided into all these different areas, and seemingly any topic under the sun has an associated philosophy. There's philosophy of science, philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of logic, philosophy of society and politics and ethics and art, and what I'm going to be talking about, philosophy of action. So the more you learn about philosophy, the more you start seeing how issues and ideas in one area actually intersect with issues and ideas in another area, so that what you want to say about, say, society and politics can actually affect what you're going to say about even the nature of science, the nature of scientific explanation. And if all goes well, you start to get a sense of how things in the broadest possible sense, meaning everything, how all of these things actually hang together, how they actually all form one world or world view. Now, to put a little bit more meat on the bones, I think of philosophy as primarily a conceptual inquiry and not an empirical one. What exactly do I mean by that? Well, when you're doing philosophy, you are not likely to be running experiments in a lab. You are not likely to be doing field work. You're not likely to be engaging in this direct kind of empirical investigation, setting up an experiment, making observations. Rather, you are engaged in more conceptual enterprises, thinking your way through a problem, running through a line of reasoning, a line of argument. And in that sense, I think of philosophy as a conceptual inquiry. What you're worried about is how to think about a certain kind of subject matter. Now, I want to clarify that philosophers typically are not interested in concepts for their own sake. A certain kind of philosopher might be, but typically we're not aiming for just a description or a taxonomy of the concepts we actually have. What we're interested in is how we ought to be thinking about a certain phenomenon, and it's the phenomenon that we're interested in. So to give you an example, this is probably my first real philosophical experience, but it didn't come from a philosophy class, it came from a high school physics class. So some of you might have actually encountered this recently. In this class, we were reproducing experiments on the nature of light and trying to determine, is it a particle or is it a wave? And as some of you might know, the weird thing is, as you start doing the experiments, it kind of seems like it might be both, right? Sometimes light acts like a particle, sometimes it acts like a wave. And at a certain point, our teacher stopped the class and just opened the floor for discussion. Says, well, what are we to make of this? How are we going to make sense of what's going on? And someone in the back of the class just sort of interject and say, well, look, it's got to be one or the other, right? It's got to be either a particle or a wave. And the teacher just said, why? Why should it be one of those two things? Remember, the concept of a particle and the concept of a wave, these are concepts that we came up with to help us navigate the world. And in particular, in the context of physics, right? To help us understand the nature of certain phenomena. And it's not just guaranteed in advance that we've hit on the right concepts. We might need a whole new concept, a whole new way of thinking about the world if we're going to actually understand the nature of light. And that task is not primarily an empirical one. It's empirically informed, but to discover the nature of light, part of what you needed to do was rethink things, right? Reconfigure your concepts, how you're thinking about the nature of the world. And that's kind of how I think of a lot of philosophical topics, philosophical issues. We're a bit puzzled by some aspect of the world, and it seems like in order to resolve the puzzle, in order to get clear on things, we have to sort of reevaluate how we're thinking about the world around us. And the philosophical task is to determine, how are we going to do that? How should we revise how we're thinking about things? Right? Now, that brings us to the philosophy of action. And like I say, this is an enormous subject matter. The question I dread being asked the most when I tell people what I do is, what is philosophy? The one I dread second most is, what is the philosophy of action? Right? In short, it is a set of issues that are philosophical in nature and related to human action. Not all that informative, right? And a brief glance through a standard companion or set of introductory articles, like I have here on the slides, you immediately start encountering a whole range of topics. So the difference between actions and mere events, right? I might raise my arm in order to hail a taxi, or my arm might just simply shoot up as the result of a spasm, right? And you might start wondering, well, what is the difference between these two kinds of phenomena, and where exactly does the boundary get drawn between the things we do, so to speak, and the things that merely happen to us, so to speak. Likewise, you might be interested in the nature of practical reasoning and relevant mental states like desire, intention, and emotion, right? As you go through your day-to-day life, you have to start planning out your day. You have to start reasoning about what you're going to do or not going to do. And you might start getting interested in, well, how exactly does that process work, or how ought it to work? What does good practical reasoning look like? There are special varieties of action that seem to pose interesting issues. So the issue of animal action. Are any non-human animals actually capable of acting in the way that humans are? And if so, which ones, right? You might think my cat seems to be capable of planning and forming decisions and acting on them. Seems like she might be capable of action in the sense that humans are. Not clear whether a spider or an amoeba can. There are mental actions, like the various actions I performed as I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about this evening. Group actions. So can something like a corporation actually engage in actions of its own, apart from the actions of the individual members? Does it make sense to think of a corporation as something that forms intentions, makes decisions, has beliefs about the world, and acts on them? And negative actions. And I wrote a whole book about this. This is roughly acting by not doing things. So intentionally omitting to pick up a friend at the airport, or refraining from having a cup of coffee late in the evening, right? I'm not going to be able to talk about all of this, but I'm going to touch on some of these. Oh, and I forgot to mention, classic, this is a problem that goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks, the nature and possibility of free will and moral responsibility. We tend to think of ourselves as having a certain level of control over our behavior. We can be held accountable, responsible for some, if not all, of our behaviors. And various philosophers take different views on what exactly this amounts to, whether such things are even possible at all, and if they are, what the boundaries are, what their nature really consists in. Like I say, I won't be able to cover all of these sorts of topics, but I'll be touching on a few of them in passing. What I primarily want to address tonight is some issues about how our picture of ourselves as free and rational creatures can be reconciled, if it can be reconciled, with a broadly scientific picture of the world. And so in that limited way, addressing Sellers's broad question of how things hang together, right? So I want to start with a brief mention of Carl Hempel, 20th century philosopher of science. One of Hempel's main interests, and something for which he's best known, is his account of explanation in the natural sciences. He thinks whether you're doing fundamental physics or chemistry or biology, what you're primarily interested in is giving an explanation of certain kinds of phenomena, right? An object falls to the ground, makes contact with a certain amount of force. Why did that happen? Why did the object fall downwards instead of just shooting upwards? Why did it make contact with X level of force rather than Y level of force, right? Hempel was interested in this aspect of the natural sciences, their capacity to explain goings on in the world around us. And Hempel famously put forward what became known as the deductive nomological model. Kind of fancy terminology, but don't worry, the idea is fairly straightforward. The idea is that the occurrence of an event, like an object falling and hitting the ground, can be deduced from or inferred from particular facts, say about the size of this object, its mass, its prior position before being dropped, and some relevant law of nature, right? So as you're going through your physics class, you start learning about all these physical laws, right? Force equals mass times acceleration, right? And once you have this law in your pocket, you can combine this with your knowledge of particular goings on, particular facts in the world, and start explaining why certain things are happening the way they're happening, right? Why did the bowling ball hit the ground at this point with this degree of force? Well, because of its prior position, its trajectory, its mass, and also we have all these laws of nature that dictate how things go in the natural world, right? So for Hempel, explanation is primarily about showing that the occurrence of a particular event or state was to be expected or could have been predicted, right? When you're in your physics class, right, you can be given a problem set. It says, all right, suppose an object with this much mass is dropped from this height, hits the ground in this much time. With what force is it going to hit the ground? Well, if you have the relevant information and you have the laws of nature in your pocket, you can just do the derivation. You can just do the math and figure it out. You can show what is to be expected. You can actually predict what is going to happen. And so for Hempel, you can think of explanation as kind of prediction in reverse, right? When you're predicting, you're trying to say what's going to happen. You just run that backwards, and now you've got an explanation of something that already has occurred, right? Now, for Hempel, this model does not just apply to fundamental particles that you encounter in physics, chemical compounds you encounter in chemistry, or cells and proteins and the like you encounter in biology. This applies all the way up to human beings and human actions, right? He's primarily thinking of human beings and their actions as just things in the natural world, things in the world that is given to us by the natural sciences. We are not going to be exceptions to laws of nature. We are not going to be exceptions to this general pattern of explanation. And so for Hempel, the explanation of human behavior and human action will also follow this deductive nomological model. In effect, showing how human behavior can be predicted on the basis of prior facts and relevant laws. This is key to Hempel's account of what's going on in history, right? He's thinking the discipline of history is just one of the sciences. It works in the exact same way. We're trying to explain certain goings on in the world around us, like say the Russian Revolution of 1917, right? Incredibly interesting empirical event in the natural world. Why did this happen? What preceded the revolution that actually caused this to come about? Hempel is thinking, what an historian is trying to do is give an explanation of an event of this sort. And because human beings and their behavior are just parts of the natural world, the explanation has to work just like explanation in physics, chemistry, biology, and the rest of the sciences. Again, appealing to facts and relevant laws of nature, where here the relevant facts are going to be facts about people's psychology, right? So you can point to general unrest in Russia prior to the revolution, right? People's animosities about financial inequality, worries about what was going on in the First World War, right? All of this becomes your set of relevant facts. And the relevant laws are going to be laws of psychology, laws that tell you how people tend to behave given their beliefs, desires, hopes, dreams, and so on. Right? So this was a very influential account of explanation in the natural sciences, and also a very influential account of what's going on in history. This idea that history is really just one of the sciences. It works in broadly the same way. It's not without its problems, however. First and foremost, the idea that historians have to rely on laws of psychology in order to do their work doesn't obviously fit very well with the actual practice of historians, right? If you've ever taken a history class, you probably did not come away with it with a list of newly learned laws of psychology, right? It's not like taking a physics class, right? Oh, now I understand all these laws of motion, right? You don't come out of a history class with laws of psychology. And even if there are such laws, and I'll mention later on, it's not entirely clear that there are, the discovery of such laws would seem to be the task of empirical psychology, not the task of history, right? An empirical psychologist who's doing experimental studies on human beings, if anyone's going to tell us what the laws of psychology are, it's those people, right? The actual empirical psychologists. Historians are typically not doing that. They're not running experiments to determine laws of behavior. They're poring through old documents. They're looking at archival records. They're looking at archaeological evidence. They seem not to be engaged in this project of determining laws of psychology. And moreover, it would seem like even outside the discipline of history, the explanation of human action typically does not work through psychological laws, right? I submit to you that no one in this room has an exhaustive list of psychological laws in their heads, whether just learned through ordinary day-to-day life or learned in a classroom, right? I know more about the laws of motion than I do about the laws of human psychology, right? The inner workings of the human heart and the human mind. Nonetheless, we all seem pretty good at explaining our own behavior and the behavior of others, right? If you're to ask me what I'm doing on a daily basis and why I'm doing it, I can give you a pretty good explanation, right? Why are you going down to the coffee shop? Well, I'm sleepy. I need to get some caffeine in me, so I'm going to go get a cup of coffee so that I can be alert for my meeting in the afternoon, right? Perfectly good explanation of what I'm doing. No mention of a psychological law in sight, right? So at this point, I want to switch to an opposing view of the explanation of human action, right? If it's, suppose Hempel is wrong, it doesn't work the way explanation in the natural sciences does. How does it work? Well, enter another 20th century philosopher, William Dray, who I recently learned was actually Canadian. So I've managed to squeeze some Canadian content into my talk today. For Dray, the explanation of human action really works in a fundamentally different way than explanation in the natural sciences. Remember, Hempel's sort of deductive nomological model, this idea of inferring what's going to happen or showing what could have been predicted on the basis of laws, is grounded in and supported by a more general conception of what scientific explanation is really all about. It's to show that what happened was to be expected or that it could have been predicted. And Dray thinks that's just the wrong starting point for thinking about human action and how it gets explained. To explain why an action occurred just is not the same as showing that it was to be expected or could have been predicted. Something else is involved. He says, in the ordinary course of affairs, a demand for explanation is often recognized to be at the same time a challenge to produce either justification or excuse for what was done, right? Typically, say, if one of your parents says to you with a stern tone of voice, explain yourself, right? That's not naturally heard as a purely descriptive demand. They're not after just a description of prior events, right? They're asking for a justification. They want to know your reasons for why you did what you did, right? Or if you ask me why I'm going to the cafe, you want to know what my reasons are for doing this, right? The way Dray puts it elsewhere, the explanation of action has an element of justification in it. You're providing good reasons for what you're doing. So for Dray, the explanation of action, whether on a day-to-day basis or in the practice of history, does not work through knowledge of psychological laws and deduction from prior events. It works through two things. First, our capacity for practical deliberation, that is our ability to make inferences about what we ought to do based on the various reasons that we have, right? And second is our capacity for empathy, right? To see things from another person's perspective. And crucially for Dray, it's to engage in this imaginary enterprise of reasoning from that person's point of view, right? To explain someone's behavior is to make sense of it from their point of view, to see why it seemed like a reasonable thing to do, to sort of go through that reasoning yourself in this imaginary mode, right? Well, if I were Jonathan, or if I were a peasant living in 1917 Russia, what would I have done, right? That is really what action explanation is about. It's a rationalizing explanation rather than something like a causal explanation of the sort you get in the natural sciences. So again, just to take a concrete example, suppose you see me waving my arm. I'm standing on the street corner, I'm waving my arm back and forth. That's interesting. That's an interesting event going on in the empirical world. There's someone saying they're just waving their arm about. What could possibly be going on? What could explain this event? Well, Dray's thought goes, if you want to explain why I'm doing what I'm doing, what you have to do is engage in some empathy, try to see the world from my point of view, and then exercise your capacity for rational deliberation, right? Given your knowledge of my beliefs, desires, hopes, and wishes, can you reason your way to this action of waving my arm from my point of view, right? So you might say, well, I can tell from what's going on that Jonathan wants to signal a taxi. He wants to get from the Bilkent campus to downtown Ankara, and he wants to do it quickly. So he wants to signal a taxi, right? Well, suppose I were in Jonathan's shoes. I want to get in a taxi so I can get to downtown Ankara. Well, then I might reason as follows. I want to signal the taxi. If I wave my arm, I will signal the taxi. So I'll wave my arm, right? That's a bit of practical reasoning, a bit of practical deliberation. And it seems like if you can attribute this bit of reasoning to me, you have made sense of my behavior. You've got an explanation of why I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm moving my arm about so that I can hail a taxi, right? No mention of psychological laws. It's all about empathy and the capacity for practical reasoning, right? So that's Dray's perspective. And again, this was also very influential, although obviously not with the people who were influenced by Hempel. So in and around the mid 20th century, we get this conflict between two opposing views of how human actions are to be explained. And it's a conflict that is based in very fundamentally different approaches to the nature of explanation and what exactly we're up to in day-to-day life, and also in the natural sciences and in the discipline of history, right? This seemingly small issue actually has wide ramifications for how different academic disciplines work and how they actually relate to one another. Now, Dray's account is not without its own problems. I just want to mention two of them. First, you might be suspicious of Dray's sort of fundamental picture of explanation as really just providing rationalization or justification. You might have a sense that something is missing from that picture of something is missing from that picture of explanation, right? So here's Hempel putting this into words. It says, it seems to me beyond dispute that any adequate explanation of an empirical phenomenon must provide good grounds for believing that the phenomenon did in fact occur. Yet this requirement is not met by a rational explanation as conceived by Dray, right? He's thinking, well, look, if you're going to explain a particular event, what that means is explaining why it happened as opposed to not happening, right? The explanation has to make sense of why this actually happened. And it seems like simply appealing to the reasons that I have for engaging in a certain course of action doesn't on its own explain why I performed the action rather than not, because unfortunately, a lot of the time I fail to do things that I have good reason to do. Right? I can have very good reasons for, say, going to the gym this morning. I didn't do it though. So simply listing the reasons I had that would have justified going to the gym is not enough to explain my behavior, because I didn't actually go to the gym. Hempel thinks there's something missing from this picture, some sort of oomph, some sort of explanation of why the event actually did happen. And relatedly, there's a worry about what makes a certain explanation of someone's behavior correct rather than incorrect. So on Dray's picture, what you're doing when you explain my behavior is running through a bit of practical deliberation, seeing what kinds of reasons I had to do what I did, and seeing if you can sort of reason your way to this course of action. Saying, well, if I had those reasons, I would have done the same thing. Right? But sometimes there's more than one line of reasoning that might have justified someone's action from their own point of view, right? You can have many different reasons for engaging in the very same course of action, right? And say, why are you going to the cafe? Well, it could be because I want to get a cup of coffee, but also I know that a friend of mine tends to hang out there and I would like to bump into them. That's another reason for going. Maybe I just would like to be seen at this coffee shop. That carries a certain amount of prestige, being at this coffee shop, and I would like to inherit some of that. That's another reason I might have for going. And the question is, okay, then what makes it the case that I acted for one of these reasons rather than the other, right? If you engage in this bit of empathy, you could reason your way to the action from any of these reasons. So as far as Dray is concerned, they're all equally good explanations of my behavior, but it seems like they can't all be correct, right? Or at least they might not all be correct. What is the difference between a real explanation of your behavior and a mere rationalization, right? A listing of reasons that you had, but you didn't actually act upon. Right? Now, it's at this point that the sort of protagonist of the story comes in. I don't say hero because I don't want to give the impression that I agree with everything that this person says, but they're sort of the main figure here. This is Donald Davidson, American philosopher of the 20th century. Now, what's interesting about Davidson for our purposes is his attempt at reconciling these two opposed pictures of the nature of human action, the ways in which actions get explained, and really the place that actions have in the natural world and the place that we human beings have in the natural world, right? If you're thinking like Dray, you're thinking that human beings and their actions are just ordinary events in the empirical world, so they have to be subject to the same kind of explanation as other empirical events. If you're thinking like Dray, you're thinking, no, this is really a whole different kettle of fish. This is a whole different kind of thing. Human actions and the mere motion of particles are just completely different kinds of things that need to be explained in different ways. Right? One is a very unified picture of human beings in the natural world. The other is very disunified. Human beings and their behaviors are something different, something special. And what Davidson wants to do is steer a middle course here, try to do justice to the thought behind both of these worldviews. So Davidson agrees with Dray that explanations of human actions are rationalizing in the way that Dray thinks they are. You're really trying to show why someone's behavior seemed reasonable or like the good thing to do in that circumstance. You're not relying on psychological laws in order to explain behavior. Nonetheless, he agrees with Hempel that humans and their actions are not some special kind of thing in the world. They are just ordinary empirical phenomena, and so in a sense will be subject to laws of nature and scientific explanation. So he wants to reconcile these two ideas and do it in a way that will allow him to avoid the problems that Hempel and Dray both run into. So the basic idea here is that human actions are both empirical phenomena subject to causal explanation, just like the motions of particles, and rational phenomena subject to rationalizing explanation, right? Hempel is thinking that human actions are just ordinary empirical events subject to natural laws. Dray thinks, no, they're really something special, there's something different. Davidson is thinking, we're just looking at the same thing from two different points of view, right? Hempel and Dray are looking at the exact same phenomenon, but we can look at this phenomenon from two different perspectives, and that's what gives the appearance that there is something special here, when really there's just events in the natural world subject to natural laws. So for Davidson, to explain an action is to rationalize it, right? To appeal to someone's reasons for doing what they did. But, and here's the key departure from Dray, it says, reasons are in fact causes, right? When you cite someone's reasons for their behavior, then despite the fact that you're not relying on any sort of psychological laws, you are in fact citing a cause of their behavior. So an action gets rationalized by a bit of practical reasoning, right? So in the example of reasoning my way to waving my arm, the reasons that justify my behavior are as follows. I want to signal the taxi, and if I wave my arm, I will succeed in signaling the taxi, right? Now, Davidson thinks these reasons correspond to mental states in my mind. And there's a desire that I have to signal the taxi and a belief that I have that if I do such and such, I will actually achieve my goal. And these mental states, these beliefs and desires, play a causal role. They actually bring it about that a certain action occurs, right? This is sometimes referred to as a billiard ball model of explanation of action. I've got these mental states floating around in my mind, and they actually have some causal oomph to them. They produce behavior on my part. Now, on this picture, rationalizing explanation is, in a sense, a kind of causal explanation, right? You are appealing to prior events and facts that played a causal role. So Hempel is right to an extent that human actions are subject to causal explanation, and this explanation appeals to particular psychological facts about human beings, facts about their mental states. Oh, and I should say, no, this is for this slide, pardon me. We seemingly solve one of the primary problems facing Dray's account, actually both of them. First, because my mental states cause my behavior, the explanation actually gives grounds for believing that the action did in fact occur, right? You're not merely citing reasons that I had floating around in my mind. When you give an explanation, you're citing a cause, something that produced my behavior. And so you actually get an explanation of why I did this rather than that, right? Why did I wave my arm even though I had reasons not to, say, like my shoulder is really tired and it's going to hurt? Well, the reasons I had for waving my arm had a causal effect. They actually produced behavior. The reasons not to raise my arm didn't. They just did not have that causal oomph. So we actually get an explanation for why my behavior in fact occurred. And Davidson thinks we now have an account of what makes one explanation the correct explanation, right? I have all these possible reasons for going to the coffee shop. What makes it the case that I acted on some of these reasons and not others? It's simply that those are the reasons that caused my behavior, right? That's what makes them my reasons for doing what I did. And that's what makes this explanation the correct one. And this is actually Davidson's primary argument for this picture, that rationalizing explanation is a kind of causal explanation. If you don't think this, you really have no way of solving Dray's problem. You have no way of distinguishing correct and incorrect explanations, genuine explanations from mere rationalizations. If you're going to draw that distinction, you need to think that people's reasons for action actually play a causal role. Now, as I say, for Davidson, rationalizing explanation is, in a sense, causal explanation, because what you are appealing to are, in fact, causes of someone's behavior. And the fact that they are causes is what makes this the correct explanation of their behavior. But there's still an important sense in which Hempel is wrong or mistaken. And it's quite simply that although rationalizing explanation appeals to what are in fact causes, they make no appeal to causal laws, whether they be physical, chemical, biological, or psychological. That's just not how the explanation works. You don't need to appeal to a law in order for the explanation to be a good one. All you need is that the things you're appealing to as reasons are also playing the role of causes. Whatever natural laws are in place don't need to get mentioned at all, right? And so Davidson thinks the problem for Hempel is solved. We can say that people's reasons, that their mental states cause their behavior, without going as far as Hempel does and saying, well, then the explanation of human behavior has to appeal to something like psychological laws, which seems just false. It seems like that's not how we actually do it. And it seems not to reflect what actually happens in the discipline of history. Right? So this is Davidson's kind of reconciliation of these two opposing viewpoints. Try to say, well, look, when I raise my arm, say, what's happening in the world is a certain kind of event. My arm going up, right? The motion of muscles pulling on bone, moving this object up into the air. That is an ordinary empirical event, and you can think about it in purely physical, chemical, biological terms, and you can talk about physical, chemical, biological causes and effects, taking this purely natural scientific point of view on things. But you can also think of it in a different way. You can think of it not just as my arm going up, but as me raising my arm. And when you do that, you can start looking for a different kind of explanation of what's going on, right? An explanation that shows my behavior to be rational or justified, right? But in doing this, you're not shifting your attention to a completely different phenomenon. You're simply taking a different point of view on the same old phenomenon, right? Now, we're already at 10 minutes to 9, so I may not actually have time to say anything much about free will, but suffice it to say, according to Davidson, like I say, actions are natural or physical events. They just have the right sorts of causal history. They're caused by certain kinds of mental states. Now, for Davidson, this means that both our actions and their causes do at some point fall under natural laws, right? There are physical, chemical, biological laws you could appeal to give a prediction of my behavior, or to give a different kind of explanation of my behavior. And that, you might think, still leaves a residual worry about human action, human agency, just that if our behavior is subject to these natural laws, if everything I do really is a consequence of prior physical, chemical events, and my behavior can be deduced from these events in accordance with natural laws, it's not clear that I can have anything like control or freedom over my behavior. It seems like if only you had enough information and knew what the laws of nature were, you could deduce everything I'm ever going to do just as you can deduce the force with which an object falls to the ground, provided you know the mass and trajectory and the laws of nature, right? Again, Davidson thinks that, well, really, this is just a matter of taking different perspectives on the same phenomenon. We have this sense of ourselves as free and in control when we view our behaviors as things explained by reasons, right? Explanation that does not appeal to natural laws. But when we look at our behavior as purely physical, chemical, biological events, then we see that it is subject to natural laws. And you might worry if that's really going to satisfy your sense of freedom and control. You might think, well, for Davidson, what this really amounts to is that when we look at action from a certain perspective, we're simply ignoring an important fact, which is that all of our behavior is the direct consequence of natural laws. You might think that's not a robust enough sense of freedom, that somehow we must be free from the grip of natural laws. Like I say, I don't really have time to talk too much about that, but if people want to ask about this in the Q&A, feel free. But for now, I'll just say, I skipped all the way past the end and all the way back to the beginning. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. So you can ask questions, by the way. If anyone wants to ask questions, you can write it in chat. There is a question in chat, and then Serbay. First, I will read the chat, and then I will come back to you, Serbay. And I have questions too, by the way. So, yeah, if we have time. All right. So let me just read the question from Tarkan Bozkurt in the chat. Does there have to be a reason for every action? Right? What if the person waving his hand when asked says, "I don't know"?
Right. Good. This is great. So another prominent philosopher of action in the 20th century that I didn't mention is Elizabeth Anscombe. And she has a lot of interesting things to say about the nature of action explanation. And she keys in on exactly this point. She seems to think that this really is the mark of human action, human agency, that you know what you're doing and why. Like, if you didn't realize what you were doing or didn't know why you were doing it, it would somehow fall short of being a fully deliberate, intentional course of action, right? You say, what are you doing? I don't know. I have no idea, right? That usually signals a mistake, something that you did by accident, right? So if I'm, say, making my coffee in the morning and I reach for salt instead of sugar, you ask me, Jonathan, what are you doing? Why are you putting salt in your coffee? I have no idea, right? Because I didn't do it on purpose, right? I wasn't doing it deliberately. This is a mistake on my part. And this is an idea that gets a lot of traction. So I think what a lot of people think is that there will have to be a reason for every action on some level that you are in fact aware of. If you didn't know what you were doing and why you were doing it, that would show that it wasn't a deliberate, intentional action. It would have to be something like a mistake on your part. It's a good question.
All right. So then can we say that if it is not according to this perspective, if we are doing something without knowing why we are doing that, so for example, maybe we are under hypnosis or something like that, so we are just kind of preconditioned or something like that. And then it's in a sense, then it is not us who is doing that, right? Maybe our body is doing that, but it's not as an agent. And agent, again, the technical term. Maybe you can say a little bit about what agent means.
Yeah. I think Davidson has a nice way of framing this. Saying the fundamental task of a philosopher of action is to distinguish the things we do from the things that simply happen to us, right? And in a hypnosis case, it's easy to sort of get the sense that, well, once the sort of trigger word is said, you get the sort of Manchurian candidate thing. the person stops acting and things just start sort of happening in the
Mhm,
body, right?
mhm,
They're
mhm,
kind of
mhm.
on autopilot.
Yeah,
Something is in control of their behavior, but it's not them.
yeah.
And you might think, in one important sense, that is not it, unlike, say, my arm going up as the result of a spasm in my muscle tissue, right? Something happened, but I didn't do anything. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like in some sense the person becomes like an observer of his own behavior or action rather than the originator.
Right.
Uh,
And that's a great way to think about it. Think about like how it would feel if you saw your arm moving,
yeah, mhm,
and that's how you knew what you were doing. This is a
uh-huh.
huge topic that Anscombe
Yeah,
talks about
yeah.
a lot.
And then you try to explain that, that
Exactly. Like
happened.
at that point, your behavior just looks like an external empirical
Mhm,
event, not an action of yours. If you're just
mhm,
seeing your
mhm,
hand moving, it's like, oh,
mhm.
my arm is moving towards the window. How strange. What's going on? Like,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
not what happens when you're actually deliberately moving your arm to open the window. So you
yeah.
wouldn't know what you were doing in this detached, purely observational
Yeah.
way. Yeah.
Sleepwalking, for example, just John O'Connor wrote an example of
Mm,
just the body is doing something, but without the
right.
role, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
So why are you in the kitchen last night? I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. So this philosophy of action, then we are focusing more on the deliberate, intentional kind of. We are trying to understand that and how it differs from what's happening. The happenings in nature.
Right. And a lot of folks in the 20th century, that's sort of how they would draw this distinction between actions and mere events. Actions are these deliberate, intentional things, and what that
Mhm,
amounts to is being subject to a certain kind of explanation in terms of
mhm,
reasons.
mhm.
And for folks like Anscombe, it's also the person themselves has a special kind of knowledge of what they're doing and why. That's the sort of mark of deliberate agency.
All right. Serbay, I think you will be able to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Okay, now I hope you can see me. First of all,
Yes.
thank you for being here, and we're very happy to see you here as Lyceon Philosophy.
It's my
Thank you for
pleasure.
accepting our request. And yeah, I don't know if I understand it completely true, but I was going to ask something like that. And this is, for example, yes, today, right now, I'm going to drink something, and
Mhm,
I can see now a cup of tea and a cup of coffee. Yeah,
mhm.
and I'm going to drink one of these. And now let's say I'm going to drink coffee because it's just a basic explanation of me that I can say I love coffee, but when we think deeply about why I love coffee, isn't it like it's all about something magical that happens in something chemical that
Mm,
it's all about chemical reactions. Yeah, I love
right,
coffee because it's something magical happens in my brain about loving coffee. So
right.
is it like all biological or chemical or something like natural?
Mm, good. Yeah, I think putting on my Davidson hat, I think Davidson would probably agree. I think, yes, at a certain point, this kind of explanation in terms of reasons comes to an end, right? If someone were to ask you, why do you like coffee more than tea? Well, you might not have a reason for that, right? You just do, right? And the explanation for that, if there is one, would probably be purely chemical, biological. There's just something going on in your brain that makes it the case that you tend to prefer one rather than the other. Or maybe there's some deep like psychoanalytic explanation, right? You're cut off in traffic by a coffee delivery truck as a kid, something. Um, um, but right, I think Davidson would think still an explanation of your behavior is that your desire for coffee, your preference for coffee, right? Explanation has to come to an end at some point, right? You can't just keep asking, well, why and why and back and back and back. And so he's going to think the rationalizing explanation that just says, well, I prefer coffee, so I'm going to have coffee instead of tea, perfectly fine. We would perfectly accept that in an ordinary day-to-day context. You know what I mean?
Yeah, okay. Can I ask one more thing about free will, about something
Yes,
else,
please.
about our choice? For example, I love drumming and I love listening to metal music. Yeah, really fast.
Me too.
But now, when you start drumming, it's like, yeah, you keep drumming, and at some point, you don't know what to do. You're just doing it like a machine. So while we're doing it, how can we talk about free will or something else? You know, you're just trying to follow the band and
right. Like at a certain point,
okay.
doesn't this purely become an automatic response?
It's not like my free will. It's just like I'm a machine and I'm trying to drumming at some
Right,
point.
right. Interesting. So, and this connects up with a more general sort of topic of what's nowadays called habitual actions, things that you can seemingly do, as we would tend to say, without really thinking about it, right? The whole key to learning to play an instrument is that you don't have to think about all the individual movements anymore. That's the mark of learning to play, right? Learning the rudiments. You have to think about every single stroke. You get to a certain point, you don't need to do that anymore. You can just do it like that, right? Now, there's a couple things you might say about this. One way to think about this is not in terms of actions versus mere happenings, right? It's not as though when you sit down to play a song and you get to a groove and you just know how to play it, you might think, that surely doesn't just happen. This isn't like a spasm. This is, in some way, you are in control of your behavior, right? Like you are the one dictating what you do. That's why you deserve applause when the song is done, right? Because you were actually playing the song, right? One way to think about this is in terms of levels of representation or levels of detail in representation, right? When you're first learning to play a song, you're breaking it down into individual parts, you're playing it really slowly. So when you're thinking about what I'm doing, right? It's really getting down to every individual movement. Those need to be under your conscious direction. Once it becomes a bit more natural, you can just think, I am playing this part of the song, right? In the same way that if I want to raise my arm like this, right? I could have moved my arm in all sorts of minutely different ways, but I didn't actually attend to all those little individual movements. If I were first learning to do this, or say I've been injured and I have to relearn how to do this, then I would have to do that. But now I can just think of it as raising my arm. And then there are all these semi-automatic processes that are underlying or supporting my agency rather than undermining it. At least that's a way you might think about this. Yeah.
All right. So there was another example of this more like happening kind of thing, the laughing example. So in a program, for example, someone, a contestant starts laughing and then they ask, why are you laughing? And then she says, I don't know, right? So it's just, right. In this case, it is more like the laughing is something that happens to her, right? Rather than, rather than something
you're
she
really
does.
Seized by uncontrollable laughter. It's like, that's not an action. That's a thing that happens to me.
However, drumming, right? Or maybe speaking, I'm talking right now. I have no idea what my tongue is doing, you know, my lips are doing. I'm not really paying attention to the individual movements of what's happening in my mouth, right?
Right,
but
you just think of the entire sentence.
It's more like I focus on what to say and my mouth takes care of how to perform that.
Or I can be a bit cheeky about this. Tam aksine, yani ben şu anda Türkçe öğreniyorum ve ben Türkçe konuştuğumda çok daha bir detaylı bir şekilde ne yapmam hakkında düşünmem gerekiyor. Like, I'm starting and stopping. I'm having to wrap my mouth around new vowels.
The correct pronunciation of the R's, for example, which are different from, you know.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, I know.
And some mornings I'm downstairs ordering a cup of coffee and I'm painfully aware it all just turns into mush. I tried to speak a little too fast and it just didn't work.
Yeah, the way I think about these things is like, so there's this thing that I'm doing, the action, and my action is constituted by the movements of my lips and, you know, so it's like when I do this, for example, I'm greeting someone, this is not a causal relation between my hand, my raising my hand and my greeting. My raising my hand doesn't cause greeting. It is greeting, but it can be all different kinds of, right? So I am just, my action, my intention is to greet, but a certain way it comes about.
Right, and you sort of, you don't have to consciously think about all of
Yeah.
the minor details.
Yeah.
Also in the chat, we have like motor skill, muscle memory.
Right.
Other elements that are sort of governing this.
Right.
I'm not sure how great this analogy is. You might also think about like a sculptor who's putting together a sculpture. What they're doing at some level, they are manipulating the position of molecules and eventually subatomic particles. They do not, and probably should not, think at that level of detail, right? They don't need to think. They just think, I am now like moving the arm of this statue a little bit. Right? It's just a higher, a more abstract level of thinking.
Yeah. All right, because we started a little bit late, so I will ask one more question. I'm seeing there's, I cannot see another question, but I have one, and that's about artificial intelligence.
Okay.
How about artificial action? So I will just one thing. More specifically, the intentional stance kind of thing. So I am playing chess with the computer, and then I am giving. So there is of course the physical explanation, right? What's happening in the transistors and all the electricity and all that. What's happening in the hardware? But also I am giving another explanation. I'm saying, oh, it's trying to get my queen. It's trying to defend itself. You know, it's doing this kind of strategy. So I'm attributing desires. Trying to beat me up, or beliefs. It believes that I will do this, so it's taking precaution. So then, can we really talk about like Davidsonian way of approaching it from two different perspectives, and then saying that there is action there actually?
I think so. Yeah, I think there are like subtle points of disagreement between Dennett and Davidson, but I think broadly the picture is the same, which is, well, for Davidson, what it is for an event to be an action is for it to have the right kind of explanation, and an explanation in terms of mental states, intentions, beliefs, desires, and what have you. And elsewhere, in his philosophy of mind and language, which I haven't really talked about, he defends this kind of position that, well, what makes it the case that a creature has mental states is just that you get a good explanation of their behavior by thinking in that way, right? If you try to attribute mental states to, say, a water bottle, you're not going to get very far. There's really nothing very interesting to be said about its behavior. It's like, well, I guess it just really loves being on my table. So whenever I put it down on the table, it just stays there, right? Its behavior is not complicated enough to really warrant a more sophisticated kind of explanation. To the extent that we get a better explanation by thinking in terms of beliefs and desires. That's just what makes it correct to attribute these mental states to a creature. So for Davidson, right, the question of animal intelligence, right? How far down the chain do you get before it's all just automatic reactions in accordance with laws? Well, at some point, it might just not make a whole lot of sense to think in terms of beliefs and desires, right? It's weird to think of a mitochondrion as having desires to provide energy for the cell and beliefs about how to do that. You can explain everything in a much simpler way. My cat, however, much easier to explain her behavior in terms of desires for sunlight, to be by the fresh air, to get petting, and all this sort of stuff. And similarly for artificial intelligence, I think Davidson would have to think that would be the logical conclusion to draw.
Even though maybe there is no phenomenal consciousness, but still intentional states like the beliefs and desires and things like that, we can say. So there are a couple of more questions, but we don't have much time, but I really want to ask the questions too. So maybe we should be quick about this, but so one question is about Libet's experiments, which is a huge topic actually, but if you think you can summarize your view about this, do you think Libet's experiments, they do show something about our having or not having free will?
I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you. This is an area of literature that I really don't know much about. I sort of know the basic idea behind the
Uh-huh.
experiments, and I know there's some controversy about how the results should be
Yeah.
interpreted, but this is something I have just never found the time to actually look into. So
Yeah.
I'm afraid I don't have anything very interesting or original to say
There's
on
a
that subject.
huge literature about this, how to interpret and how to, there are lots of different versions of this experiment,
Yeah.
and about experimental setup and, all those.
Yeah,
So,
so my
okay,
my sincere apologies. I wish I had something really
sure,
interesting
of
to say
course.
about that.
Yeah, but it is a big issue.
Yeah.
And last question, chess programs are unfair as computers don't see and process information as a human chess player visually see and think. So I don't know about unfair. So the chess programs, they work differently, of course, from the way that
Seemingly, yeah.
we think. Yeah. So we are, like, sometimes people say expert programs, things like that, learning and things like that. Unfair comparison from chess. Yeah, so the computer is not thinking like we do, right? So a good chess player actually sees the movements, but there's some computation going on, as in the computers. And yes, it is not fair in the sense that those are different things, but still, if we go with Davidson, right? I mean, still we can attribute desires and beliefs, and that can help us understand or even predict what it will do.
Right. So you might think, so yeah, if you're willing to follow Davidson on this, you might think,
yeah,
well, yeah, a chess program plays a chess game very differently from the way I do. It's going through a list of rules and this whole space of possibilities that it can calculate really quickly. I think, does that show that it doesn't have beliefs, or does it just show that this thing can process information a lot quicker than I can, or just has this encyclopedic knowledge that it can go through very quickly, right?
Yeah.
It's approaching a problem in a different way, but that's not the same thing as saying it doesn't have mental states, right?
Yeah, maybe we can think it like, so as I said, so this is my greeting someone, right? When I do, and this is constituted by my hand movement. It could have been so many different ways, right? It's constituted by all kinds of potential possible different hand movements, but still the greeting. Then maybe one can say, in us, there is a biological way that my belief and desire is realized, in a certain way. But in the computer, it is more computational kind of state, realizes or constitutes belief. So then the idea might be human belief and computer belief are different in the sense that what really kind of realizes them, what kind of system.
Right.
But still they are beliefs.
There's still both beliefs.
Right?
Yeah.
Maybe one can say that.
That's the idea.
Yeah. Okay, all right. And this artificial intelligence stuff is, of course, huge, and there are lots of lots of so the computers having beliefs and desires, for example, would that give us moral responsibilities, moral obligations towards them, for example?
Yeah, another colleague of mine in the UK, that's his whole topic is like,
a big topic.
Moral responsibility towards artificial intelligence.
Right?
And something I didn't mention in the talk, but this is a theme that actually came out when I was teaching some of this material to a graduate course, is these sorts of disputes about the nature of explanation in science and history and the explanation of human behavior. They correspond to disputes in the sort of philosophy of mind, with people having different conceptions of what it means to attribute mental states. You have what's called the theory on one hand, which says, well, if you're attributing mental states, you have a sort of folk psychological theory that talks about belief and desire and intention and what these things are like and how they interact, and a rough map of human psychology and how it works, right? Then you have the simulation theory, which is much closer to what Dray was talking about, which is, well, no, really, to attribute a belief to someone is to see things a certain way from their point of view, and likewise to attribute a desire. Like if I attribute to, sorry, do you just go by Serbai or Ahmed? Serbai, Ahmed. If I attribute the desire for coffee, what I'm effectively doing is like, all right, I'm going to run a simulation of this person. Here we go. Coffee would be great right now, right? That's effectively what I'm doing. I'm simulating being you, and wanting coffee, right? That's all I'm doing.
Yeah. I mean, from my more, philosophy of mind kind of perspective, what is more important for me, actually, given my work in philosophy of mind, is phenomenal consciousness. So then my basic question is, can artificial intelligence systems suffer? Can they feel pain?
Right.
So having a belief that something is bad is one thing, and feeling the fear, really feeling,
Right. Yes.
experiencing it is another thing. And I think the experience part really gives us moral obligations towards a being. That's what I think. But anyway,
Right.
So this is huge topic.
Right. Now we're getting into like philosophy of mind, artificial intelligence, ethics.
Yeah. Maybe in the future we can talk about artificial intelligence.
Like I said at the beginning, like the more you get into these topics, you see how different things connect up.
All there, yeah, definitely. All right. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for this great talk.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This is a lot of fun.